we have allowed ourselves to embrace an ideology which at its core states that all governance is about maximizing corporate profit at the expense of the citizenry. For what do we have structures of government? For what do we have institutions of state, if not to hold up all the citizenry and especially the most vulnerable? If you go back and look at the 1980s in especially the Scandinavian countries, they eradicated poverty virtually. I lived in Switzerland. I studied French in Switzerland, and there were no homeless. The mentally ill were taken care of. It has arguably one of the best healthcare systems in the world. My oldest son was born in Lausanne. And that was, it's actually a privatized system, but it's heavily regulated. Everybody pays into it, but everybody has health insurance. Senior public school teachers earned about as much as doctors. And with the wealth given to us as Americans, we could have eradicated poverty. We could have created a country that was much different than what we have created. And what's happening now is that we are being rapidly reconfigured into a kind of neo-feudal society, an oligarchic society where increasingly the bottom two-thirds of Americans are hanging on by their fingertips. You have a shrinking, diminishing middle class and an elite that is just making obscene amounts of money at our expense. And you can't sustain, first of all, you can't sustain a democracy and an oligarchy. That's not a new idea. Thucydides wrote about that, about ancient Athens. But secondly, because there are no self-imposed limits, and in this sense Karl Marx was right, that unfettered, unregulated capitalism, especially on a global scale, is a revolutionary force. They will push and push and push until there is a backlash. And I think part of what we're seeing with the security and surveillance state is a preparation for that backlash. The destruction of civil liberties, which has been brutal. The wholesale surveillance and monitoring of virtually every American citizen, which I think many of us suspected, and Edward Snowden, through his disclosures to Glenn Greenwald at The Guardian, made palpably real. The National Defense Authorization Act, and I sued the president in the Southern District Court of New York, and I won. The Obama administration has appealed it, but this permits the military to seize, arrest American citizens, strip them of due process, and hold them in military detention centers, including our offshore penal colonies in places like Guantanamo or Bagram. And when Judge Catherine Forrest wrote her 112-page opinion, which I think is worth reading, she actually brings up the plight of the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II and stripped of due process, and said that this provision in the NDAA essentially allows the state to criminalize an entire group of people and lock them away without any legal redress. And they know what's coming. The NSA has run all sorts of scenarios on economic collapse and especially climate change, and they're preparing.
Let me add one thing to that. We did this in our coverage of the G20 protests in Toronto where 1,000 people were arrested.
Right.
But I think there's pretty clear evidence that when they arrest 1,000 people in Toronto, when there's very little happening, right, this is dress rehearsal. This is training for how do you do mass arrests.
And it's also a message to everyone else. Let's remember that whatever the internal faults of the Occupy movement, and they were there, the Occupy movement was destroyed. And I was just at a trial in New York, Veterans for Peace, 25 people arrested. I was there in October 7th at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Plaza in New York, which technically closes at 10, but that's never enforced unless you're carrying out a public demonstration, that there is now a decision by the security and surveillance state to essentially seize all public space, to make any kind of protests within public space impossible because they don't want to see generated another Occupy movement. And indeed, when many of these vets were arrested, the cops were telling them, look, we're vets, we don't want to arrest you, but the Occupy movement messed it up for you because we can't allow another one. The state was quite rattled by the Occupy movement and is determined not to allow a movement, a mass movement like that, to rise up again. And yet, You read Paul Krugman's columns in the New York Times, where he constantly calls for a rational response to the economic crisis. And a rational response would be a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, a massive jobs program, rebuilding infrastructure, especially targeted at people under the age of 25. That would be rational. But the state doesn't respond rationally because there are no mechanisms, counter mechanisms now to make piecemeal or incremental reform possible, which was the role of the traditional liberal class, and I spend a long time in The Death of the Liberal Class laying this out. And so they keep pushing and pushing and pushing. You're seeing unemployment benefits being taken away. You're seeing Head Start programs being shut down. You're seeing an assault on public education. The Congress can't even cap the student debt at 3%. It's now risen to 6%, while at the same time the Fed is lending trillions of dollars to corporations like Goldman Sachs at virtually 0% interest. And then these financial corporations, especially if you're late on your credit card, are charging us upwards to 30%. I don't know what that is. It's not capitalism. It's extortion. And that's the system that we live under. So because there are no self-imposed limits, there will be a response. It may not look like Occupy. It may not call itself Occupy. Indeed, I don't think that it will. But I've covered movements all over the world. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I covered both of the Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. And you know as a reporter that the tinder is there. So having spent 2 years writing Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt out of the very poorest pockets of the country with Joe Sacco, and having been in cities like Camden, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States and not surprisingly the most dangerous, something's coming. What will trigger it? It will be benign. It will be a seemingly innocuous event.
In Brazil, it was bus fares.
There you go. In the first Palestinian uprising, it was a traffic accident. But something's coming. Now, I should add that in American society, we have a long tradition of extremist, vigilante, right-wing violence, which can be categorized as fascist, where you fuse the language and iconography of the state with the Christian religion, where you demonize the vulnerable, Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, liberals, feminists. They have a long list of people they hate. And those are powerful forces within American society. The left has been destroyed, especially the radical left, quite consciously in the whole name of anti-communism, and The Death of the Liberal Class really explains the destruction of those movements. But those movements were important because, as Howard Zinn points out, in the People's History of the United States, they opened up the democratic space. That the people who founded this country were slave-holding white male oligarchs who were terrified, and you can see it in the Federalist Papers, of any kind of popular democracy. And so that all of the advances within American society and within the industrialized world, we had the bloodiest, deadliest labor wars of any country. Hundreds of workers were killed, thousands were wounded. The violence was quite brutal and quite extreme. And so you saw with the abolitionists, with the labor movement, with the suffragists, even with the civil rights movement, movements outside the power structure, condemned as radical, that forced a liberal elite to respond and open up space. Now the radical movements are gone and destroyed, and more importantly, the liberal institutions have been disemboweled to serve corporate interests. So what the result is that we as citizens have, through the traditional structures of power, been left powerless to respond. The only hope left is to get out in the street and build the kind of mass movements that I saw in countries like East Germany, where you had 500,000 people showing up in Alexanderplatz in East Berlin, or 500,000 people showing up in the streets of Prague and in Wenceslas Square during the Velvet Revolution, which I also covered. I'm not naive enough to tell you it's going to work. But appealing to the better nature of the Democratic Party, I can assure you, is not going to work.